Okay, well, we'll get this project started on time here. Welcome everyone to the microconference reflecting on the past, present, and future of process studies for project organizing. This microconference is part of a series that's organized by the editors of the International Journal of Project Management, the Project Management Journal, the International Journal of Managing Projects in Business, and Project Leadership in Society. Just to let you know, as a matter of procedure, this microconference is recorded. It will be posted on Project Management Journal's YouTube channel. Just go out to YouTube and search for Project Management Journal. If you don't wish to have your name known publicly for some reason, it is set up so you can go in and change your name to something more anonymous, should you prefer. Okay. For today's session, our guests are Ann Langley, Maude Brunet, and our host is Monique Aubry. Just give you a quick introduction to them. Ann Langley is Emeritus Professor at HEC Montreal. Her research deals with strategic management processes and practices with a special emphasis on organizational change, decision-making, leadership, and identity in pluralistic settings. She has a particular interest in qualitative research methods, and she's co-editor of the journal Strategic Organization. Excuse me. Maude Brunet is assistant professor at HEC Montreal. Her research interests include governance and innovation of mega projects, public infrastructure projects, and public-private partnerships. She is published in several project management and administrative sciences journals and has been an associate editor for the International Journal of Project Management. She has 15 years of experience in project management. That includes as a teacher, as a consultant, as an administrator, as a researcher, and a speaker. Monique is the honorary professor in the Department of Management at UQAM in Montreal. She pursues her research on two main topics, the development of mega projects and organizing for projects. In 2020, she was awarded PMI's Research Achievement Award for her research career. Over the last few years, she serves as an external advisor on the management of public projects for several ministries and public organizations in Quebec. For today, our structure, just to let you know, we're going to have a brief presentation from our guests, followed by an interview of Ann and Maude by Monique. And we will end with questions from the Zoom attendees. Please save all of your questions until the question and answer period. And we will be using the chat feature to submit the questions. And we'll get to as many of them as we can in the time allowed. So I'm going to go ahead right now, and I'm just going to turn it over to Monique.
Yes, thank you so much, Gary, and thank you for this invitation to open up this series of activities. Today, as you mentioned, we will talk about project studies, and we have a chance, Maude and I, to conduct an interview, I would say a conversational interviews with Ann Langley. So thank you so much, and you know how much it's we are grateful to you to join us on this activity. So I'm Monique Aubry, for the one who do not know myself. I say what I find it nice in this event is that I say it's like a short lineage in the process word, I would say. We had the chance, Maude and I, to follow the methodology course, which is a qualitative methodology course with Ann Langley in our doctoral program. And I think not only for us, Maude and I, but I think that Ann, you do have a really great influence in doctoral student in administrative science in Montreal, for sure, much more wider than that. But many of us had a chance to follow this course. And I think this made some sort of a, I would not say a school of thought, but at least something really dynamic and to talk about those the issues around the process studies in different administrative fields. So for me, this webinar today is really an opportunity to learn from you and from your journey as a researcher, and maybe more than that, and to tell your story, and maybe your story may inspire, maybe a source of inspiration for other scholars in the emergence on well, today this process research, but in the emergence maybe of other ways of approaching different organizational phenomena. And also, I think it's a good moment, a good time to make some reflection towards the future of this avenue, this research avenue. And it's nice that we get Maude, who is a real young researcher, to talk to us about her perspective on the future on process studies in the project field. So Maude, do you have something to add to this? Your expectations from the...
Yeah, well, thank you, Monique, and thanks to all the leading journals in project management to have organized this event. I will have two hats today, so I will take some of the interviewer's role with Monique to ask Anne about her career, so reflecting on the past and the present, and I will also have the hat of maybe considering what's up for the future of process studies and project organizing. So yeah, we're looking forward to see how it goes, and hopefully we can also have some discussions at the end towards where is that leading us for the field of project studies.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Maude. Maybe Anne, you want to say something before we start, this conversation? Whoops, you.
Just thank you so much for inviting me to take part in the conversation. I think we just get going and have the discussion. I also wanted to mention that both Monique and Maude have been very interested in process studies, and there's a recent special issue that Monique and Viviane Sergi and Lucia Crevani made in Project Management Journal that reflects also this perspective, and I think Monique has some things to say about it too.
Oh, thank you. It's from your inspiration. But yeah, let's start with the emergence, how things started. So I would like to know how this your work, how it develops, because I believe that your interest towards the process studies, how does it happen? I guess it's not coming like a spark. So I don't know if you can say something about that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's an important thing to realize that I started out my career. I was not interested in qualitative research, and this is something that I discovered as I was doing my PhD. So I don't know how many of you here have started out somewhere else. I got my first degree in mathematics, and my second degree was in operations research at the University of Lancaster. I suppose that's where I first came into contact on the very low level with project management, because I did courses on PERT and Gantt charts, and as someone who was going into operations research. And then for the next 6 years, I was a practitioner, basically. So I worked in the private sector, I worked in the public sector, and I was an operations researcher. I was an analyst in organizations, and I engaged in projects, not big projects, but small projects of improvement in organizations. And at some point, I decided that I found the academic career quite attractive. My husband is an academic, and I thought that it might fit my personality more than continuing in practice. So I started a PhD, and I fully expected to do a PhD where I would send out questionnaires. But in my first PhD course, which was called The Foundations of Administrative Thought, I met a set of professors at HEC Montreal who became very influential for me. And one of them was Henry Mintzberg. And at that time, I was very inspired by his approach. And I realized that if I wanted to work with him at that time, I would have to do something qualitative. And so that's how I came to move from being a quantitative researcher to a qualitative researcher. But I think the interesting thing, and maybe there's a lesson there for some others, is that my experience of being an analyst in organizations was really what I drew on to develop my thesis. So the thesis was called the role of formal analysis in organizations. So basically, I had become interested as a practitioner in how people actually used the research, the consulting reports that I wrote, and sometimes in ways which were not what was written down or what I had learned in my operations research classes. And there was a lot of human elements mixed up with the quantitative elements in those reports. And so the very phenomenon that I had observed in practice became the object of my my thesis. And so that's how that happened. And I think that this is actually a very good way to get going in an academic career if you have practitioner experience, because it becomes the background, it becomes a topic area where you have tacit knowledge that other people don't have. I knew to some degree, not in a systematic research way, but I knew to some degree how people used formal analysis in organizations. And what needed to be done there was some formal and systematic research on that topic. And that became my topic. And I think that's probably a better way to find a topic than to actually go to the library and see what's missing in the literature.
Yeah.
So I recommend this approach. I think it builds on who you are, and not everybody has that experience that you can build on. So that would be one of the lessons that I would.
I guess that this proximity or this interest or with practitioner might be the part of the transition from quantitative to qualitative.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the fact of meeting someone who was interested in the topic that I was interested in. I don't know if any of you have read Henry Mintzberg's work, but he has this book, which was actually published somewhat later, which is The Rise and Fall of Strategic Planning, a great book about, very critical actually, of formal analytical techniques in organizations, notably for strategy. So the topic area was something also that was close to his interest as well. And so that's how that happened. And of course, when you have a quantitative background and you move into qualitative research, you're a little bit awkward with it at first because you don't have the right mindset. I always wanted to make sure that the sample size was big enough, and I wanted to count things. A qualitative researcher who would come from a more literary background wouldn't have that kind of sensibility or want to do that kind of thing. I moved over towards being more qualitative over time. So
yeah, and it is around these years, I think, that you wrote this very, I would say, popular paper on processes. So can you say a word about the emergence of this paper on
Yeah, before I do so, I mean, I just, Maude has put this paper up on the screen. This is a paper that came out of my thesis, which you can see that in search of rationality, the purposes behind the use of formal analysis and organization. So that really was the kind of bridge towards doing qualitative research. Yeah, so maybe we can move on to yes, so I did write a paper and it's published in 1999 in Academy of Management Review on process studies, and it's my most cited paper. The way that came about is really quite serendipitous. I had been doing, I actually had a position at the University of Quebec in Montreal after doing my thesis. And I began working with a colleague in healthcare, actually, Jean-Louis Denis, on projects of organizational change in healthcare. And we were studying the implementation of change over time. And so basically we were studying processes. But we hadn't really theorized about that. I also was working with a master's student, Jean Truax, who was very interested in technology adoption. And so he was doing a study of technology adoption, and he was very influenced by the quantitative literature. And I said, no, we're going to do it qualitatively. And he investigated 5 different small companies that were adopting technology for manufacturing processes at the time. And he was very nervous about this. He had a kind of an engineering background and really didn't like the quality, or he enjoyed it, but he felt that he needed literature which would tell him that this was okay. And he came across a paper by a book actually by Lawrence Moore on process studies. And that was quite influential in his master's thesis. And so at that point, I started thinking about theorizing what it is that I had been doing. And it was an invitation to give a talk at AGC Montreal in a small conference that led me to actually prepare a PowerPoint presentation about different approaches to analyzing process. So I gave that presentation. It was only a presentation at the time. But somewhat later, I saw a special issue go by from Academy of Management Review asking for papers on theorizing. And I thought, okay, maybe I can turn this PowerPoint presentation into a paper, which is what I did, and it was very well received. It was a paper that I wish all my publication projects went so smoothly. This one was conditionally accepted almost on the first round. The editor really liked it. The reviewers really liked it. I almost didn't have to do much to change it, and that's never happened to me again. And so that was how that paper emerged. But you know, if I hadn't had an invitation to give a talk, if I hadn't seen a special issue proposal call for papers go by, I might never have written the paper. And if I hadn't been working with this master's student that gave me the inspiration to do it, I wouldn't have done it either. So there's a lot of accidents that happen that lead to what you do in your career. And I suppose the lesson from that is you have to take the opportunities as they go by. But
I think it's a lesson learned from your story, what you say. Now, if we continue the development of this process approach, I think that Andrew van der Ven has a kind of a, I don't know if it's influence or together you went further in this thought. Can you?
Yeah, so one of the authors that was very useful to me, and I strongly recommend everyone to read his work, is Andrew van der Ven. He was writing about process. This is his paper. He was writing about process, actually strategy process, in 1992, which is quite a long time ago. And he really introduced the idea of process as looking at how things evolve over time and looking directly at how things evolve over time, rather than simply assuming a process, actually focusing really on the process itself. Also, his paper is really interesting because it develops a series of different theoretical resources that you can use to consider how things evolve over time. So, at that time, most process research would come up with a kind of a theoretical framework which would say something like, there are 5 phases, right? First you do X, then you do Y, then you do Z, then you do W, and so there would be a kind of a life cycle model. And there is a life cycle model of projects, right? And so that was the kind of theorizing that was typically available in the literature. And what Andrew van der Ven and actually Marshall Scott Poole brought to this was that there are other ways of thinking about process. And they introduced 3 other ways. One is a teleological model, and the teleological model is the idea that you have a target and that you try to reach that target, and that in doing so, you get successes and failures. And if you get a failure, well, you change what you're doing. And if you get a success, well, you move in the same direction. So that's a teleological model of process, a kind of a learning model. A third one is an ecological model, which is really kind of a Darwinian process where you start with a lot of variation, and then the environment selects out certain elements that fit better, and from that they are retained in the environment. And finally, the fourth one is this dialectical model, which personally I really find very helpful, which is the idea that processes move over time due to contradiction. So you get phenomena that interact with each other and produce new things. And in the area of organizational change, that's very much what I saw. So you have an organization which has its way of functioning, and then you try to change it. It's like a kind of a shock to the system, and you get this kind of interaction between what was and a change project, which creates something new, which is neither what it was before, nor the change project that you had proposed in the first place as a kind of a negotiation.
If I just jump in, just to come back to the turn of the century. So we are at the end of 1999, you just published your paper. You talk about the importance of having that master's student at the time. Where were you overall in your research? Was the strategy as practiced already there? How were you into methodologies? So if you can just bring us back to about 20 years ago.
Yeah, so around the time that I published that paper in Academy of Management Review, I moved to HEC Montreal. And that's where I began teaching the methods course that Monique and Maude mentioned and that they attended. And I did that for about 20 years, this qualitative methods course. And that was very helpful to me. Maude mentioned the notion of strategy as practice. Strategy as practice is a way of thinking about strategy based on what people do, rather than in terms of it being a thing which is calculated and very rational. So it's a perspective on strategy where scholars examine the doing of strategy in the moment. This is an approach that was developed mainly in the UK by people like Richard Whittington and Jerry Johnson and Leif Mullen, actually, in Sweden. And they developed this idea that strategy should be seen as a practice, as something that people do, rather than an entity that people have. And I was not particularly interested in that, but it happened that Richard Whittington had read that very old paper, the one in 1989, on the use of formal analysis in organizations. And I met him at a conference. And he said to me, you know, you're one of the rare people that has ever studied strategy as practice. And I said, oh, really? Because it is true that I had been looking at how people were using formal analysis in strategic decision-making. And so I had actually been doing research on strategy as practice without knowing it. So he involved me in writing a book. And we wrote this book with Jerry Johnson and Leif Mullen on strategy as practice as a new area. And of course, it's an approach that is very compatible with a process perspective. Looking at strategy as something that people do really gets into the doing and process. And so I was the person who actually wrote the methods chapter in that book. So we have this book, which is called Strategy as Practice, Research Directions and Resources. It was published in 2007. In the meantime, another stimulating event in my career was to start the PROS conferences. So this is another kind of serendipitous encounter where I was invited by Harry Tsoukas to join him to run a small conference in Greece, which of course you don't refuse when you're asked to join a small conference in Greece on a Greek island, by the way, on process. And so I did this, and this conference, the first one was in 2004. It was repeated many times, and as you can see, we have our 13th International Process Symposium, hopefully COVID willing, in June 2022 on roads. And it's, I think several of you in project management might be interested in this. There's still about 4 or 5 days to prepare your abstract, 31st of January. And the theme is organizing on the precipice. And so the whole context of COVID, it's about extreme context, it's about crises and similar things. And of course, it's very timely that we would be having this conference this year. It's all about process. So we've been running this conference over the last several years, and that's been a very stimulating event as well.
And if I might just ask, because it was interesting to see how you got in touch with Richard Whittington in the first place, but now we see Tsoukas, and I think you mentioned the other time we were discussing that there was a quite influential paper with Tsoukas and Chia, so maybe if you can get back to 2002 and explain a little bit to us how this happened.
Yes, Harry Soukas and Robert Scheer wrote a famous paper about process in 2002 in organization science. And I was really attracted by this paper because it's titled On Organizational Becoming. It adopts a much more philosophical view to process than I had really thought about up till then. So my paper was really a methodological paper. It was, how do you do studies of process? Harry Soukas and Robert Scheer philosophized a little bit more. They drew on philosophers, and you can see Henry Bergson on the screen there, William James, others, to theorize more about process, and particularly about process as activity, as we mentioned in our paper with Maude, that process is not just something which is not just the idea of events evolving over time, but the whole world is constituted by processes. So this idea of the world being constituted by processes really comes out of that paper by Harry Soukas and Robert Scheer. And it became very much central also in the PROS conferences that we run in Greece every year. And so this introduced me to a different perspective on process, which later became quite influential in the paper that we wrote with Maude. And I also think that that is reflected in Monique's special issue in Project Management Journal as well, an emphasis on process as constituting the world. In other words, everything is process, is moving. And that is a new kind of way of thinking about the world and how to study it. So, yeah.
Thank you for what we've been discussing now. We started with the emergence of processual approaches in organizing, and now there was more of a confirmation. So how was it from the point of submitting papers to mainstream journals? You have been working with strategic organization for quite some time. Was it still kind of marginal? Was it still difficult to be able to publish in those themes?
I think that it's over time, it has become easier to publish work, much easier to publish qualitative work in the major journals, because the major journals have all, at least in my field, I don't know so much about the project management field, but for example, and I think it began with organization science, they began to have editors who were specialized in qualitative research. That made a huge amount of difference to the ability for qualitative researchers to be heard in those journals. Academy of Management Journal began to have a team of qualitative editors who specialized in qualitative research. And there were also a number of other authors who basically, through the things that they wrote and their own experiences, showed scholars how they could rigorously do qualitative research. So I'm thinking of people like Kathleen Eisenhardt, who was very influential on the topic of case study research, and published very helpful papers on how to write case study research. And Denny Joya, who with other scholars developed approaches to analyzing and presenting qualitative data that were also very, very influential. And those kinds of articles, and maybe my article as well in AMR, help to guide researchers in finding ways of writing up their material that would be credible. I think, you know, early on, qualitative research tended to be seen as not particularly legitimate because it seemed fluffy, basically not rigorously done. But increasingly, the scholarship the qualitative scholarship has become very rigorous. And I have always encouraged qualitative papers in strategic organization. Another thing that I did in 2013 with Andy van der Ven, Harry Sukas, and Clive Smallman was we had a special issue on process in Academy of Management Journal, which was accepted by the editorial team at that time. And that was really a very successful special issue. We had over 100 submissions, published, I think, 13 papers, which are sort of become kind of models of ways of doing process research in that journal. So that was also very helpful and inspiring. Yeah.
Yes, Anne, thank you so much for that. Yes, I'm just hearing you. I'm questioning. I see that there with Tsukas and Chias, and it brings some more philosophical perspective and more theorizing. And in parallel, there are still those studies, more, I would say, from empirical view of the processes. Don't you think that there's this, I would say, proliferation, this, is this word exist in English, this proliferation?
Proliferation.
Pardon me? Proliferation?
Proliferation, yeah.
Okay. Would be benefit for process studies, or would it be too much fragmentation, dispersion, or, you know, the question?
Well, I mean, I think that it gives you a different ways of thinking about process. So, so in the paper that Maude and I and Fernando wrote, we identified 4 different ways of thinking about process. And so a first way is very much inspired by the Van der Ven article that we showed on the screen earlier, where process is considered as, you know, how things evolve over time. And actually that's dominant in most of the literature, that kind of perspective. But a second perspective fits more with Harry Sukas and Robert Chia's approach, which is to see the world as being composed of processes and focusing on activity. Activity that produces order. And so that instead of looking at how organizations evolve over time, you look at how activities create organizing or create organization, so that the things that people do produce organization. And so that activity-based perspective is less present in the literature, but I think it's increasingly so, and it produces some more innovative work. And the strategy is practice, the perspective that we mentioned, fits more with that, okay, rather than with the evolutionary approach. So those are the 2 approaches that we really discussed.
And finally, at the end, it brings more richness to the understanding of right. What happened in organization. Okay, yeah. Good. Now, and let's come in the project management field area. Yes, I was reflecting more this morning about that and saying, oh, gee, that makes quite a long time that in project studies, the temporal dimension was recognized as an important dimensional element in projects. And I was thinking of I would say, a great theorization of project as a temporary organization back to the 19th. I think it was Rolf Lundin, 95, and I would bring also Christophe Midler, who draw a lot on temporal evolution and creation of collaboration. So I think that we have some good basis to work from there. And actually, I think Maude will come to the current field, the current status, should I say, of project studies regarding the processes research. But I would like to hear you on this, how you see project and process. And I think that you are really at the cross, there is something at the crossroad. So
yeah, so I mean, I really see projects as processes in the sense that the particularity of projects, which is that they have this things that you need to do to achieve some kind of outcome. And so I think the fit of a process approach with project, with a project management perspective is fantastic. I think that and you know, as I mentioned, I did my master's degree in operations research, and you know, a critical path analysis is in many ways a process analysis. It's aimed towards organizing a process so that you can achieve an objective. It's more like a teleological perspective on that. And so when you look at projects from a research perspective, trying to understand project management, it seems to me that a process perspective is just a beautiful natural fit. The audience here is more familiar with project management research than I am, but it seems to me that although there have been people who have examined projects from a process perspective, for a long time, this was not what was the dominant perspective in project management research. And so I think that this is really coming back to the base of projects, to think of projects processually. And
yes,
so,
and yes, and I may add on that, like when I read at the first place your paper, Escalating Indecision in the healthcare sector, really, how can we say it's not project? It is really what we see and observe in many of our cases. This kind of process leading to indecision. So I guess it's a
yeah, so I can say a few words about that paper. So that this paper, it was not done from a project management perspective as such, but it is about, I mean, it is a phenomenon that we encountered when we were studying the creation of a new mega hospital in Montreal. It was based on the merger of three already large institutions into a third one. And what we were studying, we thought this was going to be an organizational change where we would see how they would implement the merger and create synergies across the three sites. And what we basically saw is, we didn't see that. What we basically saw was them spending years and years attempting to decide about what they were going to do without actually making a decision. And so that's where the idea of escalating indecision came from. And we tried to explain and articulate this phenomenon. And I can remember, you know, being in meetings where somebody would present a new plan, a new project plan for what they were going to do. and it would be negotiated, and finally they would agree on a plan, but the plan contained so many ambiguities that when it came to actually trying to implement it, they were not able to implement it. And they had to go back to the drawing board again to redesign the whole thing because in order to make decisions, they had to make the decision unclear. There was so much political, and it seems to me that this goes on all the time. And it's inherent to mega projects that when you get many stakeholders involved, very often you make decisions that can't hold. And as soon as you get to the point of wanting to dig a hole in the ground, you can't agree where to dig the hole, and so you have to start all over again. And this is basically the story that's in this paper, and it's a process story, and it's a process story of all the energy that it takes to stay in the same place without.
Yes. So does it? I see that then it's like the context of projects may bring something different to the project studies.
Yeah. And I would add that they did eventually make the decision and the hospital got built, but it took a very long time. Yeah. Our paper just describes the front end of that. But there were many, even after the end of our paper, there was a whole nother episode where they couldn't decide where to place this new hospital, which was not even included in the study. So.
Yeah, so this project offer a great opportunity to learn about process. Yeah, good. Yes, in the then if we continue like the story on the process studies, we come up with more recent event where you met with Maude, and before that, eventually with Fernando, and you brought some sort of a classification, should I say, making or putting some order in the different perspective on project studies. So can you explain or talk about this the meeting with Fernando and Maude?
Yeah, so Fernando Fachin is a Brazilian student who worked with me at HEC Montréal, and he was interested in startup organizations, but he was also very interested in the philosophical basis of process research, and he introduced me to a number of different authors who had been writing about it, and so as a part of an extension of the thesis, we developed a book chapter actually, which introduced 4 different ways of thinking about process, and Fernando, from his own reading, had come across the notion of process as witness. So this was one of the aspects that he introduced to me too. We also noticed at the same time that many scholars were talking about process, but they were using a narrative perspective to talk about process. And it seemed to us that this was rather different again from the other types of process work that we had been looking at. So we came up with, in the end, this typology of 4 different ways of thinking about process. So process is evolution, which is this idea of events unfolding over time. There was the process activity perspective, which is about how everything is made of processes and how processes constitute things. So that's the activity perspective. There's the narrative perspective, where really what we're looking at is how people offer accounts of how processes evolve over time as narratives. And so the methodologies are very much interviewing people and getting them to tell stories, or looking at texts and looking at stories people tell. So that was a third perspective. And then there was this fourth perspective, process as witness, which kind of takes a rather complicated shift by saying, well, process is with us all the time, and the researcher themselves are also moving in time with the things that they are observing. And shouldn't we include that perspective in the research itself? So that was the fourth perspective that we introduced. And that paper was actually published in a book, and it was about, we applied it to the notion of identity in that book chapter. But on thinking about it, it seemed to me, and in discussing with Maude and Monique, that this would be a perspective that would also be relevant to projects. And so we decided to look more carefully at the project literature, which was a really great adventure for me, because I was not familiar with it. And so I now have read many papers from Project Management Journal, International Journal of Project Management, and the other journals that are featured in this series, and to become familiar with the thinking in those journals, as well as project management work in some of the more general journals, and really enjoyed doing this with Maude and Fernando, and maybe Maude could comment some more on that.
I will just go back a few years before, because we had in 2019 the International Mega Project Workshop. And so we started these discussions really a few years ago, because we invited Anne to do a talk in that workshop. And so she started already to read some of the papers. We kind of helped her to dig a little bit into the literature on project studies. So she delivered this presentation in 2019, and then she talked to us about the chapter she has been writing with Fernando. And then we kind of had this idea of doing this paper, especially for project studies, to see what's going on in the field of project studies, to see how processes and processual approaches are mobilized in those studies. So we kind of started really widely to dig into the main journals to see what papers there were. We wanted to focus on recent papers. So although we have some papers that are from 2000, we really tried to capture and cover the last decade, more or so. And so we came up with many papers at the first sight, but then we kind of really analyzed them to see how the processual perspective were mobilized. Sometimes we just put in the word process, but it's not processual per se. So we really had this discussion between the three of us to see what we would retain as processual papers. And so we came up with an Excel table of about 40 papers in all the four perspectives, the approaches that Anne just described. And what we have to say is that the bulk, many of the papers are in the what we call process as evolution. So like we say, it's very classical, traditional. We go from A to B, we have a life cycle, but we really have to reflect about this and try to give a little more so that it really makes an interesting contribution. So what we wanted to do with our paper, and I'll just show it as I talk on the screen, it was really to bring in some exemplar papers of the four categories, because there are very interesting studies and project studies that cover the four approaches. So we came up with a table of 20 papers that we discuss in the paper, and we show why they are interesting. So we describe the 4 approaches, but also the empirical material, if you want, is within the exemplar papers that we selected. We took some papers from the main project management journals, but also from outside. And it was very important, I think, for us to see in other leading journals what they were discussing about projects, because there is also abundant literature on project studies. We did not only seek for projects as a context, but really project management as being discussed within the theoretical anchoring of the paper. So that was an important point also. And yeah, so maybe just to come up with some of the conclusions, there is a wide variety. Some of the approaches are maybe still not that mobilized. There is room to expand. You probably know the project as practice, which is anchored in process as activity, as Anne described, like strategy as practice is also anchored in this approach. We have the process as narrative. There is very few papers that we found. There was not that many. I think this field is kind of developing with some leading researchers that have published recently on this topic. And also the process as witness. So how do the researchers interact with the researchees? So about this relational ontology, what is going on, not only from the field results, if you want, but how is this affecting the relationship and the co-construction of knowledge? So you know, we found many papers that were kind of normative. Here is the recipe. This organization tried to implement it, and here is what it has done. But I mean, I think project management has really evolved in the past decades, and it's okay to give a place back to the researchers in the equation. So not by normative stance, but really by understanding what is going on and how this co-construction shapes over time. So Anne, maybe you want to add some points to that?
Yeah, I think what I would just add is I think that in doing that paper, I mean, the reviewers were very helpful in encouraging us actually to reach beyond the project management journals and to include papers in the mainstream journals as well. And I think that made the paper stronger. But many papers in the journals, in the project management journals, are included and are discussed in the paper. That's one thing I wanted to say. A second thing I think I wanted to say is that in doing this, what was interesting to us was looking at how, you know, time is important in projects. Time is being identified by project management researchers as particularly important in researching projects. What we saw was that with the 4 different kinds of process research, there were different ways of thinking about time. So, for example, in a process as evolution perspective, you think about time as kind of moving in a clock kind of way, so moving over time. If you're taking a process as activity perspective, you're focusing on specific moments and things that happen in those specific moments, the activities that happen in a specific moment to change things. And so you have a different idea of time. If you're looking at a narrative perspective, you're thinking not so much about objective time, but subjective time, how people in their stories actually are seeing time. Obviously, they're going to compress it, they're going to, and to what extent are they thinking about past, present, or future? The interesting thing about the narrative idea is that a narrative, a story someone tells about a project, is a story of the past, but it's also a story of the future. And in fact, you could think about project management as really an approach to trying to create the future that you are describing, right? So that it's future oriented.
And if I can just also add, yes, the concept of temporality was examined when we did our research, and we also analyzed the concept of performance. So also within the 4 approaches, it varies. And the last point is about visual representations. And I think we really had fun with this. Let me show you again the screen, because we kind of found a very representative illustration for the 4 approaches. So here it is. And I think Anne is really keen on this visual representations. And I think one of the suggestions that we make for authors is really to try to put in a visual form so that it can make some sense for you when you're building your ideas and your papers, but also to communicate them. So you see a wide variety, and we try to reflect on the use of visual artifacts also within processual studies.
Yeah, this is something that interests me a lot these days, is how do people actually draw their research, and how do they use drawing as a way of researching, but also as a way of capturing their conceptual ideas in qualitative research. So I think that this is really interesting. There's going to be, coming back to both the visuals and the notion of time, there's going to be a special issue of Academy of Management Review, which some of you may have seen go past, on time. And so Academy of Management Review is a journal which is about, which only publishes theory papers, so no empirical data, but they are having a special issue on theorizing about time. And it seems to me that this is an opportunity really for project management scholars, for whom time is really important, to see whether they might have a contribution for this special issue. And thinking about, the interaction of subjective and objective time, for example, in projects. Wouldn't that be interesting? Thinking about the role of deadlines. So there are many opportunities, I think, there, possibly for those who are interested. And this, I think it's September 2022 is the deadline for the special issue. So there's still time.
Yeah, so thank you so much for this opportunity. And it's very, I would say it fits with what you said, what happened in your career. You seize opportunities as they present. So it is how like a career build up is taking opportunity, and yeah, and nice thing happens. Yes, and I think from a process perspective, you said projects are future oriented, and in this temporal dimension, there's this tension about, or this paradox, I would say, of acting actually in a project, and a lot of professional processes are oriented toward that, life cycle and what you have to do in each of the phases and so on. But the thing is, we are always in the future, in anticipation of what would happen. And maybe I think this paradox or duality would be nice to be studied maybe more deeply in process orientation. Yeah. And I know that in extreme, the research trend on extreme project management, this is the sort of thing that some scholars are looking at. So yeah, so thank you for this information on the Academy of Management Review. Thank you. So, we are about at the end of our interview. I guess at this point, I have to say a lot of thanks, Anne, and yeah, it's as usual, I should say, because this is something when you accept our invitation, it's always, we learn so much from you. So thank you so much again. And I hope that we will have another occasion to pursue this conversation and maybe go ahead. Thank you, Maude. You are, very oriented toward the future of our field. So it was nice to hear you talking about your experience with Anne with this paper on studying projects processually. So thank you so much, and I hope that the participants appreciated this this interview, this talk. At this point, I think we are ready to take any questions. I don't know if Gary would be there to help us with that.
You're muted, Gary.
That's my, I spend half of my time online muting and unmuting myself, I think. If anybody has any questions, please go ahead and send them in through chat, and I will read them. If they come in duplicates, I'll try and filter them out a little bit. I actually have one that I could start with. I like to bring a lot of my research into the classrooms, into especially executive classrooms. And I was just wondering how process studies translate into the practice, into being able to communicate and talk and give advice to the professionals out there.
So I think what process studies do is they focus on the how. A lot of research can tell you, that this is better than that. But process studies really help explain the how. And so, I have used several of the cases that I have studied, which are process studies in the classroom, very much as case studies, where what you can do is use a process case study and take people up to a certain point in the case where certain events have happened, and then challenge them. What would you do next? What is going to happen next? And use theoretical frameworks where they can make some judgments about that, and then take them through to the next stage. And then you can see how some of the ideas that are theoretical ideas that are present in the case are manifested. So I think that they are a wonderful resource for teaching, because you've got real life cases, and you can take a case study into the classroom. I've also, another thing that I have done is get the class to read a case or an article that we have written on the case, and invite one of the protagonists to the classroom to discuss it with. That's usually very successful. So I think there are many opportunities, and in fact, because it's qualitative, and because you are collecting data, you can quite easily turn a research case into teaching cases as well. I haven't done it that much, but many of my colleagues do this, which is you have more than one product from your study. So yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. I still don't see any questions coming in, which, oh, here we go. Lavignon also adds his thanks to Ann, Maude, Monique. And let's see, process studies welcome tensions, paradoxes, and contradictions in things. Now, are there tensions of using process studies in projects because they are temporary in nature?
Maybe Lavignon, you'd like to ask the question directly, and is that possible?
Yeah, I think our group is small enough that if we can go ahead and start letting control out to the group. So Lavignon, do you wish to join us and ask the question?
So thanks a lot, Gary, for the opportunity, and a big thanks to the three of you, Maude, Ann, and Monique, for this wonderful interview. So my question is this: I know that at the heart of process studies, we welcome tensions, contradictions, and paradoxes, and that's the beauty of process studies as compared to the other sort of research methods. Now, the question of mine is the following. So, because projects are temporary in nature as compared to permanent organizations, which are permanent in nature, do you foresee any sort of tensions when it comes to studying projects with process studies, as opposed to permanent organizations?
Well, I think that deadlines are an interesting phenomenon that when you're studying using a process approach, you need to consider. I mean, that they have effects on processes. So, there's the question of the hardness of deadlines, the flexibility of deadlines and how that affects processes. There's a very famous paper, which I don't know any of you know, which is in, I think it's in Academy of Management Journal, which is about projects and about deadlines and how people work to deadlines. And there are patterns which this author, Connie Gersick, came up with, which suggests that if you have a deadline for something that you want to do, there is a midpoint transition. So you start doing it, and you reach the middle of the time that you have, and you see what's happened up to now, and you see how much time you have at the end, then you switch your way of working. And I don't know whether this works for projects, but this from project management researchers have seen the same kind of phenomenon, but there is something about realizing that you're halfway through and it's not done and it's not going to get done unless you do something else. And there's a kind of a moment of panic where you might have this. And of course, it depends on to what extent you can stretch the deadline. That seems to me that is also an interesting phenomenon in project management. I have personally organized a conference. That deadline is not movable. Really not. Okay, if a COVID, in time of COVID, maybe it's movable. But most conferences, it's just, there's nothing you can do. It's going to happen whether you're ready or not. So that's a hard deadline. But, you're building a hospital. Well, if it takes a bit longer, you pay a penalty, but nothing, so it's not impossible. So there's, and actually, even the deadline that you get from a journal for your R&R can probably be stretched. So there, those things, that the hardness and softness of deadlines probably affect people's behavior, and that's a really interesting topic for study. I don't know if that answers the question, but
thanks a lot for your insight, Anne, as always.
Thank you. We have Anne, who had a question on the chat. I don't know if Anne is here. With Anne Klitgaard.
I'm studying project as practice, and I'm looking into this time element that you construct a plan, and that's the future, and you're sort of a project manager in the construction industry, funny enough, where I am, sees it as the future. I'm just wondering, this process studies, you said process as actions. I'm not quite sure how it links with the project as practice approach.
It's very close to the project as practice approach. I see the process as activity perspective as very, very close to the project as practice perspective. I see them as very similar. And one of the examples we gave in the paper with Maude is they label what they're doing project as practice. So for me, it's pretty much the same. So I don't particularly see a difference. It's about the doing in the moment.
And if I can just add on this, because what we have seen is that in the last decade, there was many papers from the 4 different approaches, but we have seen that in the past years, there has been more in this stream. And Anne mentioned at the beginning, a special issue on process studies from Monique contributed with Viviane Sergi and Cravani. So there was quite a few of the papers from the special issue that we labeled them as activity as practice, as process as activity. So yeah, we have seen that there is more interest recently on this approach specifically.
But I think that was an important question, because it can be confusing as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, there was one question that came in to me, not to the general audience. And the question is, do process studies presuppose a particular epistemological stance?
We would argue that depending on which of the 4 process approaches that you would develop, you might have a different onto-epistemological stance. So, but the approaches we were looking at are all qualitative. So while they're not going to be quantitative, pure positivist approaches, but there would be we associated each approach with a different kind of ontology. So we associated the project as evolution perspective with a more what we call a substantive ontology, where there's an understanding that the world is made up of things and those things change. And we associated the project as activity perspective with a process ontology, where you look at the world as composed of processes. And depending on which perspective you focus on, the methods, the appropriate methods may be different. We associated the project as processes. Narrative perspective is what we call an experiential ontology. So looking at how people understand the world, a kind of more of an interpretive perspective. And we associated the processes witness perspective with a relational ontology. So each perspective is associated with different beliefs about how the world is made, and also would lead to a dominance of different kinds of methods. Although, one thing I would say is that qualitative data is kind of multivocal. You can do an interview, and you can take an interview from a kind of a positivistic ontology. You can look at the interview and say, well, this is what happened, and this is what the person told me. I'm going to triangulate with other interviews, and I'm going to try and find out the truth of what happened. That's what we do in courts of law. We try and capture truth. But you can take an interview and take an interpretivist ontology approach and look at it as reflecting how people understand the world. And it's not a question of truth, it's a question of interpretation. You can also take an interview and you can understand it as an effort at persuasion, or of somebody trying to convince you that it's discourse. And so it could be the exact same interview. It probably would be fun, actually, to try this out. Is to take an interview and say, well, you know, this is true. This is what this person thinks, and this is what this person is trying to convince me about. It's three different ways of interpreting the same talk. And so all qualitative data has that kind of flexibility about it, but you really should be clear about which one you are using when you're looking at your materials.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Let me just check to see real quick. I don't see any.
Joanna here. Joanna?
Oh, yep. That one just came in. You wish to join us, Joanna?
I can try to do it. My camera is just not functioning today. I didn't manage to get it. I'm sorry. So one of those days. Thank you so much for this very inspiring conversation. I tried to do process studies and also use a more strong process view. And one thing that we struggled a lot with was trying to develop visualizations that would not impose a linear view of time. Because as soon as we put it in some kind of visualization, we almost make it into a kind of classic process. And then it takes away the more strong process view of it. And we read a lot, and there are articles about how to do it with lots of examples, and we usually see then the outcome of it. And I just wanted to hear a bit more about what happened before that and your experiences around it and struggling with, I imagine you struggle as well with kind of making it visible and why we're doing it. Because also sometimes some of the examples, they look a bit more like us authors making sense of the data than anything that the readers can actually understand. And there's no balance between the two.
I think that's a very good question. And the process as activity perspective, the strong process perspective, to be very frank, it's quite hard to draw. It's quite hard to draw. And in the figures that we put in our paper, there is one for a paper that we classified as being a strong process paper. And you will see that it's full of clouds and not so many boxes and arrows. Because the boxes and arrows kind of take you into a very linear notion of process, where essentially you convert the notion of time into space. So you have a timeline at the bottom with events and connections between events, and that really doesn't fit so well either with a strong process or as a process activity perspective. So I think it's a challenge. An interesting suggestion for looking at this is there's a paper by Martha Feldman. It's in the Handbook of Process Organizational Studies, where she argues that to capture process, to capture strong process, you should focus on the arrows. So it's what is going on in the arrows that is important. As soon as you put boxes, it kind of pins it down into very linear things. So what you need to do is to think about how to draw and understand process through the arrows. And she offers a number, in this article, she offers a number of alternative ways of showing that. So that might be helpful. She also has a recent paper in strategic organization, which is really interesting, which is about how, it's about Hurricane Katrina, actually. And it was about how professionals who were trying to give mental health services following Katrina adapted their processes. And she has a nice diagram there, which is not a box and arrow diagram, has other forms, but really adopts a kind of strong process perspective on that. So that's a few recommendations. I mean, you could argue that maybe we're wasting our time trying to do something which the ontology doesn't help us with. I'm not sure that we're wasting our time. I do think it is extremely useful, always, as much as you can, to have a visual to help your own thinking, but also to communicate your thinking to others. I always find it quite difficult to read a paper that does not have a figure and to make sense of the message in a simple way. So I have always found figures generally to be helpful. But of course, figures and diagrams have certain affordances which can distort just a little bit what it is you were trying to say, make it less subtle, perhaps.
If I can just add on that, we found also for the narrative approach that it's also very difficult to do, but we also encourage you and other researchers in project studies to maybe think about that, how we could visually represent a narrative study on process approaches. So.
Yeah, it's almost a contradiction in terms, when you're talking about narrative. It's a story. It's not a picture.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I guess at this point in time then, I'll call a close to the session. I really appreciate the time that you've given us today. Very informative, very well organized. And to everybody watching, just remember that this will be available on the Project Management Journal's YouTube channel within a few days. And you can share it with your friends, and everyone else will have the advantage of the wisdom that we heard today. So Anne, Maude,
thank you.
and Monique, thank you so much.
I just want to say thank you, Gary, for organizing it, and to Monique and Maude for helping me do this. So thanks.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks.